In today's episode, we trace the journey of a man who devoted 2 decades to a single summit, who at last reached the highest point on Earth with tears in his eyes and his hands lifted in victory, only to face an ending so merciless, so devastatingly near to safety, that it would linger in the minds of all who remembered him. It was August 14th, 2019. At the foot of Mount Everest, the massive slopes rose into the sky, climbing toward a summit that reached 29,032 feet above sea level. It was the mountain known as the Savage Mountain, the peak that killed 1 in 4 who tried to stand on its summit, a place where preparation, experience, and discipline offered no guarantees. Standing there at base camp was Will Springer, 31. At 31 years old, he was finally here. Everest had lived in his imagination since childhood. Back when he read mountaineering books in his bedroom in Boulder, Colorado, he had memorized summit photographs, studied every route description, and absorbed wind pattern records left behind by climbers before him, as if knowledge alone might persuade the mountain to be merciful. This moment had taken 20 years to reach. 2 decades of smaller summits, weekend hikes through the Rockies, frozen climbs in the Cascades, and punishing training sessions that left his muscles burning and his lungs raw. Every expedition, every altitude simulation, every late night spent poring over mountaineering journals had been another step toward this single goal. Will wasn't wealthy. He worked as a high school geography teacher, but he saved with discipline. Every spare dollar, every tip, every modest bonus from grading papers went into an envelope labeled simply Everest. Frugality became devotion. Discipline became armor against the odds waiting above. Beyond money, he built his body for the climb. Winter ascents in Colorado, summer treks through the Rockies, and weekends dedicated to strength and endurance training became routine. He studied weather systems, altitude sickness, and self-rescue techniques with the same seriousness he brought to the physical work. Every step, every pull-up, every long march under a heavy pack was training not just for the ascent, but for the mental endurance Everest demanded. He measured risks, rehearsed emergencies, and still understood that preparation did not guarantee survival. Before leaving, Will slipped a small, worn photograph of Emma into his jacket pocket. It was a talisman he planned to carry through snowstorms, screaming winds, and every step cut into frozen snow and broken rock. He traced her smiling face with his thumb, fixing her features in memory, imagining her laughter filling their home, a warmth that felt impossibly far from the mountain's cold indifference. He had promised them both that he would be careful, that he would turn back if anything felt wrong, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. Jennifer had held him tightly at the airport, lingering longer than usual, reminding him that coming home safely mattered more than any summit. Now, at base camp, 16,900 feet above sea level, Will felt the weight of that promise. But alongside it was something else, the pull of the mountain itself, the gravity of a dream 20 years in the making. The expedition team was small but experienced, 8 climbers in total, supported by high-altitude porters. Leading them was Rashid Khan, a Pakistani mountaineer who had summited Everest 3 times. Rashid was known for his conservative judgment, for turning climbers around when conditions weren't right. That reputation was exactly why Will had chosen this expedition. The strategy was simple. They would establish 4 camps along the south route. Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, Camp 2 at 21,300 feet, Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, and Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. From Camp 4, they would launch their summit attempt. The full schedule, including acclimatization rotations, was expected to take roughly 6 weeks. The first 3 weeks blurred together in a cycle of ascent and descent. Up to Camp 1, then back down. Up to Camp 2, then back down again. It was repetitive and exhausting, but necessary. Acclimatization meant giving their bodies time to adapt to the thinning air, stimulating red blood cell production, and learning to function where oxygen levels were only a fraction of what they were at sea level. Will handled the altitude well. His years of preparation were evident. While some teammates labored for breath and slowed to a crawl, he kept a consistent, controlled pace. Rashid took notice. One evening at base camp, the expedition leader remarked that Will was strong and that his body seemed to adjust well to the elevation. The comment filled Will with quiet confidence. Maybe this was truly within reach. but Everest would decide the timing. In early August, conditions shifted. A powerful storm system settled over the Khumbu region, driving winds across the mountain that approached 100 miles per hour. Snow fell dense and unrelenting. Temperatures at Camp 4 sank to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. For 11 days, the team remained at base camp, confined by wind and snowfall, checking weather reports repeatedly and waiting for a window to open. The tent strained beneath accumulating ice. The stove burned constantly. Each blast of wind felt like a reminder of how little control they had. Day after day passed in sameness, a rhythm of restless pacing, dehydrated meals, and low conversations about risk, survival, and the mountain's authority. Above them, Everest slopes remained quiet and distant, a steady reminder that progress would come only when the mountain allowed it. Wind shook the tents without pause, driving snow and shards of ice against the canvas. One day blended into the next, with little to occupy them beyond scanning the sky, tightening lines, checking gear, and pushing back a boredom that felt dense and airless. Climbers spoke quietly about earlier expeditions, about those who hadn't returned, and about the harsh reality that sometimes waiting carried its own risks. Will felt time pressing in from all sides, not only the mountain's schedule, but his own, the family he had promised to come home to, the approaching school year, the life that continued beyond the sharp ridgelines. He tried to remain steady, but the delay wore on him. He had planned to be back by August 20th. Classes began August 26th, and missing the first week wasn't an option. He had already stretched his timeline as far as he could. Each lost day narrowed his chance at the summit. On the 7th day of the storm, Rashid gathered the team and reminded them that the weather was outside their control and that climbing in those conditions would be extremely dangerous. Will knew he was right, even if accepting it felt difficult. Then, on August 12th, the pattern shifted. Forecasts indicated a possible summit window opening on August 15th. It wasn't ideal. The window appeared tight, perhaps 36 hours of workable weather before another system arrived, but it was their chance. Preparations began immediately to move up the mountain the next day. They advanced quickly. On August 13th, the team climbed to Camp 2 and stayed the night. On August 14th, they moved to Camp 3 and, after only a short rest, continued upward to Camp 4. It was faster than preferred. Normally, a full night would be spent at Camp 3, but the limited weather window left little flexibility. Camp 4 rested on a narrow platform carved into the mountain's shoulder at 26,000 feet. Here, they had entered the death zone, the altitude where the human body cannot endure for long. Every hour at this height meant progressive oxygen deprivation, organs working under strain, cells slowly breaking down. At 4 p.m. on August 14th, Will crawled into his tent. His head throbbed. Nausea lingered in his stomach. He forced himself to eat a freeze-dried meal and drink as much water as he could tolerate. Outside, wind struck the tent repeatedly, the fabric snapping sharply in the gusts. Rest didn't come easily. Between the elevation, the tension of the coming climb, and the constant wind, Will drifted in and out of shallow sleep. His thoughts returned again and again to Jennifer and Emma. He pulled out his phone. There was no service at this altitude, and stared at the wallpaper image. Jennifer and Emma at the beach the previous summer, both smiling, sunlight in their hair. He had taken the picture less than a year earlier. It felt far more distant than that. At 11 p.m., Rashid moved from tent to tent, signaling that it was time to wake and prepare to leave in 1 hour. Will's pulse surged as he pulled on his boots, checked his equipment, and clipped into his harness. After 20 years of planning, training, and saving, the moment had arrived. The team gathered outside the tents at midnight. 8 climbers stood in the bitter cold, moving deliberately in the thin air. The temperature hovered at negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Will couldn't feel his toes inside his boots. He stamped his feet, trying to drive blood back into them. They stepped onto the route at 12:15 a.m. on August 15, 2019. The final pyramid of Everest was a brutal stretch of steep ice, exposed rock, and fixed lines. Will climbed inside the narrow cone of light cast by his headlamp, eyes locked on the crampon points of the climber ahead, advancing one careful step at a time. Thinking had faded. There was no room for strategy or analysis, only motion, step by step. Even so, a quiet part of his mind registered the faint creak of shifting ice, the the soft hiss of snow moving somewhere out of sight. A warning he chose not to dwell on. Step, breathe, step, breathe. Each time his crampons bit into the frozen surface, small jolts traveled up his legs. His lungs burned, every breath sharp and thin. Sweat froze along his brow, forming fine crystals that caught the beam of his headlamp. Pain spread through every muscle, yet each controlled movement felt like progress earned. The darkness around him seemed to breathe. The wind moaned across distant ridges. Ice complained under strain, and far below, unseen depths pressed into his awareness. Even if he refused to look, time lost its meaning. The climb became nothing more than light, rope, and motion. The circle of illumination from his headlamp, the fixed line clenched in rigid gloves, the steady crunch of metal on ice. His lungs felt raw, as if scraped with glass, every inhale contested. Sounds carried unnaturally far, wind tearing at the mountain, ice shifting somewhere in the dark, the muted crack of snow echoing through the stillness. Time dissolved. He thought briefly of the mountains he had climbed before, the pages he had studied and memorized, but none of it carried weight here. Only this movement mattered. This step, then the next, then the one after. Existence reduced to its simplest form. At some point, he no longer knew when, the eastern sky began to pale. Morning was approaching. Will lifted his head and saw the summit ridge silhouetted against the slowly brightening horizon. They were near. On Everest, though, near was deceptive. The final stretch, the summit snowfield, was a broad, exposed slope pitched at a frightening angle. A single misstep, one misplaced crampon, and a climber could slide thousands of feet down the face of the mountain. As he reached the Hillary step, Will's legs were on fire, every breath sharp and piercing. His lungs protested violently, each inhale feeling like shards of glass. But the summit was within reach. Perhaps 200 feet of elevation remained. Maybe an hour more. It was still possible. At 9:47 a.m. on August 15, 2019, Will Springer stepped onto the summit of Everest. The rush of emotion struck him with physical force. Tears froze along his cheeks as he lifted his arms, too drained to cheer, smiling behind his oxygen mask. Nearby, his teammates reacted the same way, embracing, crying, snapping photos with unsteady hands. 2 decades of longing had reached their end. Even through the triumph, Will remembered the numbers. Most fatalities on high mountains occurred on the way down, when fatigue dulled judgment. He kept his focus, intent on making it back alive. They remained on the summit for 15 minutes. Will took photos with his phone. The view defied reality, peaks rolling away in every direction, and tried to fix the scene permanently in his mind. Then, together, they turned back toward the long descent. Descending brought its own struggle. In some ways, it was worse than the climb. Will's legs were spent, his knees aching with each movement. The fixed ropes that had guided them upward now served as lifelines, lowering them carefully down the steepest sections. So far, everything remained steady. The weather continued to cooperate. The team was holding together. For the first time, Will let himself believe he might actually pull this off. A quick image passed through his mind. Jennifer in the kitchen making tea, Emma laughing at something he couldn't hear, and he caught himself wondering what ordinary air would feel like again. They arrived back at Camp 4 in the early afternoon. A few climbers suggested stopping there to rest through the night and continue down in the morning, but updated forecasts warned of shifting weather after dark. Remaining in place risked being pinned down for days. The choice wasn't easy, yet the reality of the death zone settled the debate. Every additional hour at that elevation increased the danger. They had to descend. After a brief pause to drink and force down some food, they resumed their descent. The plan was to reach Camp 3 before nightfall. Will moved almost mechanically now, drawing on reserves he hadn't known were there, down the fixed lines, one careful step at a time. His focus had narrowed to a single direction: down, safety, home. They passed Camp 3 around 6:30 p.m. as darkness began to creep across the mountain. Even with light fading, the team chose to continue toward Camp 2 that night. Resting at 20,000 feet was far safer than remaining at 24,000, where altitude and exposure magnified every risk. Too tired to debate, they continued into the dark. It was then that the rhythm shifted. Around 7:45 p.m., with full night settled over the slope, Will was descending along a fixed rope. The pitch was steep, roughly 55 degrees, but not vertical. His headlamp cast a tight beam over the line ahead and the snow beneath his crampons. He was about 1,000 feet above Camp 2, less than an hour from a tent, from hot tea, from relative safety. Will stepped down, transferred his weight, and felt something shift under his right foot. The investigation would later clarify the cause. A patch of aging, fragile ice, likely compromised by repeated temperature swings, had fractured beneath him. His step had provided the final stress needed to break it free. In the instant that followed, Will felt the ground vanish and his body begin to slide. For a split second, the mountain seemed to thunder around him, the sound swallowing thought. Training took over. Will rolled onto his stomach, drove the pick of his ice axe into the slope, and forced the points of his crampons into the ice, executing the self-arrest maneuver he had practiced countless times. The motion was automatic. For a brief moment, it worked. His slide stopped, but the sudden halt twisted his right ankle sharply sideways. He felt and heard a snap, followed by a surge of pain that shot up his leg so violently he nearly lost his grip on the axe. Robin, a climber from Beijing positioned just above him, saw the fall and called out to the others. Rashid moved quickly down the line to reach Will. In the narrow beam of his headlamp, he evaluated the scene. Will was secure for the moment, held in place by his axe and crampons, but the intensity of his pain was obvious. Rashid helped reposition him more safely and clipped him firmly into the fixed rope. Even through the thick mountaineering boot, it was clear the ankle was severely broken, possibly compound. The situation had shifted from serious to critical. Will tried to stand. The instant he placed weight on his right leg, pain detonated through him so fiercely his vision blurred white. At 22,000 feet, in complete darkness, with a climber who could no longer walk, Camp 2, ordinarily less than an hour away, might as well have been miles, the descent had become something entirely different. For the next 4 hours, the team worked to lower Will toward Camp 2. Progress was painfully slow and fraught with risk. 2 climbers braced him from either side as he attempted to hop on his uninjured leg. On steeper sections, they rigged ropes and lowered him carefully. Each shift in position triggered fresh waves of pain through his shattered ankle. Still, they advanced, slowly, methodically, foot by foot. Will drifted between sharp awareness and haze. At times, he was fully conscious, jaw clenched against the pain, calculating each placement of axe and crampon. At other moments, altitude, exhaustion, and the medication Rashid administered pulled him into something unreal. Images surfaced in fragments: Emma's face, Jennifer calling his name, the classroom where he had taught, flickering like an old film. He replayed the single step that had failed him. He gripped the rope, the axe, and the fading clarity of his thoughts, trying to anchor himself as the mountain seemed to tilt and blur with every strained heartbeat. He pictured himself at home, stretched out in bed, wrapped in warmth and soft sheets. Up here, the cold never relented, biting into muscles and joints without pause. Pain and fear lived side by side, with brief flashes of hope, as if some part of him still believed he would survive this, still watch the sun rise over Boulder, still feel Emma's hand in his. Every inch he descended felt like a triumph, and at the same time, a reminder that safety could seem close and yet remain out of reach. His thoughts kept circling back to Jennifer and Emma, to his classroom, to his students. He replayed the moment over and over, angry at himself for that step, for not testing the ice, for letting fatigue dull his caution when it mattered most. They reached Camp 2 at 11:30 p.m. Getting Will inside a tent was another struggle, but eventually he was laid in a sleeping bag, his injured ankle elevated. Rashid cut away the boot. Will cried out as it came off, and examined the injury by headlamp. It was severe. The ankle was massively swollen, twisted at an unnatural angle. Rashid believed it was broken in several places, possibly an open fracture, though there was no way to be certain without imaging. Rashid told him plainly that he needed to be moved down the mountain as soon as possible. A rescue would be attempted in the morning, with a helicopter requested if weather allowed, though flying at this altitude carried serious risk. Most likely, Will would have to be carried all the way to base camp. Will gave a weak nod, barely absorbing the words. The pain medication had dulled his thoughts. All he wanted was sleep. The tent smelled of cold fabric, metal gear, and the faint metallic scent of blood from his ankle. Outside, the wind battered the canvas, each gust sounding like a warning beat. Spent and hurting, he slipped into broken sleep, his ankle pulsing with each heartbeat, while his teammates lay awake, planning routes, weighing options, calculating ropes and manpower. Outside, the mountain stood unmoved. In his dreams, Will drifted through warmth, home, and a life that felt impossibly distant. He woke repeatedly during the night, confused, gasping for air, pain cutting through the haze. At one point, he realized he was shaking uncontrollably. Later, a crushing headache set in, so intense it felt as though his skull might split. By morning, August 16, 2019, something was clearly wrong. Beyond the injury, Will felt off in a deeper way. His thinking was sluggish. Words came slowly. When Rashid spoke to him, Will struggled to respond, his thoughts dragging as if stuck in thick syrup. Everything felt distorted. The sky seemed tilted, sounds stretched and warped. It was as though the world itself was bending under pressure. Rashid recognized the signs immediately. Will was developing high-altitude cerebral edema. Swelling in his brain, combined with shock from the injury, was pushing his body toward failure. The situation had become critical. The swelling alone could be fatal, and delay would only make it worse. They couldn't wait. The team moved at once, but lowering an injured, barely responsive climber down Everest in daylight was only marginally safer than doing it at night, and Will was deteriorating rapidly. They rigged ropes to lower him on the steepest sections. Where the terrain eased, two climbers supported him, dragging him between them. Will faded in and out. At times, he understood what was happening. Other moments, he was back at his desk teaching, or standing on a beach with Jennifer and Emma. The descent from Camp 2 to Camp 1 took 6 hours. Under normal conditions, it would have taken 2. At Camp 1, Rashid attempted to call for helicopter evacuation, but the weather was already turning. The narrow window had closed, winds were rising, clouds were building. No aircraft could fly in safely now. They rested for 2 hours at Camp 1, trying to get food and fluids into Will, trying to stabilize him. But the reality was unavoidable. He needed to reach base camp and then a hospital as quickly as possible. That meant continuing down the mountain. The section from Camp 1 to base camp should have been the simplest. The slope was gentler, the altitude gradually lower. Base camp, at 16,900 feet, was where Will's brain could begin to recover. But his body had endured too long in the death zone. The broken ankle, the trauma, the cerebral edema, the exhaustion. It all combined into a perfect storm of failure. Around 4 p.m. on August 16th, as the team carefully moved him down a moderate slope, Will suddenly stopped responding. His eyes were open, but unfocused. His breathing had become irregular, shallow, labored. Rashid leaned over him, shaking him urgently, desperate to keep him conscious. Robin checked his pulse. Fast, weak, irregular. Base camp was visible below them, just 30 minutes away, the tents promising safety. Every second felt critical. The team broke into a shuffling run, carrying him between them. His head lolled with each step, his breathing growing more labored. The tents were so close, almost within reach, but the mountain had one final merciless twist to deliver. At 4:17 p.m., less than 15 minutes from base camp, Will Springer's breathing stopped. He was lowered to the ground immediately. Rashid began CPR, pressing on his chest and giving breaths, continuing for 20 minutes. At 21,000 feet, after days in the death zone and multiple organ systems compromised, Will showed no signs of life. At 4:37 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Investigators later determined the cause: high-altitude cerebral edema, worsened by trauma, exhaustion, and the broken ankle, which triggered a cascade of oxygen deprivation his body could not overcome. Rescuers noted his ice axe was worn from repeated self-arrests, his supplemental oxygen nearly depleted, and the tent at Camp 2 frozen solid. Summit photos and route logs confirmed the extreme conditions during the climb. The team carried Will's body the rest of the way to base camp, where the expedition doctor confirmed his death. It was later airlifted from Everest and returned home to Colorado. Jennifer and Emma awaited in solemn silence. Expedition records, gear logs, and witness accounts confirmed that Will had followed safety procedures until the descent. But the combination of altitude, injury, and prolonged exposure proved fatal. Though he had reached the summit, Everest claimed the final toll. Will had survived the peak, but the mountain had the last word.